In ancient times, there was an endless war between humanity and monsters. Thousands of years ago, King Yu used the power of runes to seal the ancestor of the monsters. To free this ancestral monster from eternal imprisonment, the 1,000-year battle between the races began. However, King Yu knew he would die soon, so he entrusted the power of the runes, capable of defeating monsters, to the 5 great families. From then on, society began to determine a man's status based on his runes, with 9 rune bearers being the most honored, and those with only 1 rune considered the lowest. In the present day, as night fell, a young man was working, greeting customers at a store. A visibly irritated man spoke with disdain about inferior people, yet still asked the clerk for some cigarettes. Quickly, the clerk asked for a moment as he went to get the requested item. Shortly after, the young man handed the pack to the customer and said the price was 30 yuan. The man, outraged, questioned how the boy still had the nerve to charge him, claiming he risked his life fighting monsters for losers like him. He then asked where the manager of that dump was. At that moment, another clerk appeared and asked the man if there was a problem. The man, even angrier, pointed at the boy behind the counter and shouted that he should be fired, saying that a one-run loser like him shouldn't dare to ask for money. Finally, he stated that he never wanted to see the face of someone with only 1 rune again. Sometime later, the manager called the young man, Xiao Qi, to talk about what had happened that day. Xiao Qi said he wouldn't make things difficult for Brother Su, and then resigned voluntarily. He continued, saying that he had witnessed this kind of situation many times before, as those with more powerful runes always treated those with fewer runes as if they were beneath human beings. Xiao Qi assured Sun that it wasn't his fault and that he didn't need to worry. He emphasized that Sun had always been kind and had taken care of him. Sun then handed Xiao Qi his monthly salary and wished him good luck. And so, Xiao Qi left his job. Outside, a cheerful girl was waiting for him. Xiao Qi asked if she had waited long, and with a sweet smile on her face, the girl replied that she hadn't. That girl was the protagonist's sister. She said she had been making some money from the stories she wrote, so her older brother no longer needed to work multiple jobs. Xiao Qi patted her head and said her health was more important. He then asked her to leave the money with him, saying he would take care of everything. The two began walking down the street and stopped in front of an ice cream shop. Xiao Qi asked if she wanted some ice cream, but the girl said she wasn't feeling well and couldn't eat cold things. Xiao Qi replied that having ice cream once in a while wouldn't hurt, so he asked the vendor for a strawberry-flavored one. The girl asked if Xiao Qi wanted a little, but he refused, saying that was kid stuff. She replied that she wasn't a child anymore either. Seeing his sister happy with the ice cream, Xiao Qi thought it would be best to talk about the resignation only once they got home. Suddenly, a shrill sound echoed all around, and a terrifying monster appeared, heading straight toward Xiao Qi and his little sister. Quickly, Xiao Qi grabbed her hand and told her to hurry to the nearest shelter, as there would surely be members of the Zhang family guarding the area, and they would be safe there. The girl's ice cream fell at that moment, and when she turned to look at it, she stopped in her tracks. Seeing this, Xiao Qi asked her to wait a moment, then hugged her, lifted her onto his shoulders, and ran off at high speed. He thought it was the first time he'd heard of a monster entering the safe zone, especially since the Zhang family, one of the 5 families that had received runes directly from King Yu, was in charge of that area. The monsters kept chasing everyone around them. The protagonist tried to understand how a monster had managed to enter the zone, but his greatest concern was getting Linlin safely to the shelter. Some time later, a group of people had gathered in front of a local building. Xiao Qi recognized a woman named Aunt Zhang and asked why no one had gone inside the shelter. Suddenly, a man with an air of superiority drew everyone's attention and asked them to listen. The man announced that the shelter had limited space and that only people with 3 or more runes would be allowed in. The crowd began to panic, as most of them had fewer than 3 runes. The protagonist then stepped in front of the man and said that if people gathered in such numbers there, they would attract even more monsters, and the shelter wouldn't last long. He reminded everyone that the Zhang family protected that zone and that help would arrive soon. The man replied that Xiao Qi was very wise, then sarcastically asked if he would like to lure the monster away and wait for the Zhang family's rescue. He added that Xiao Qi was just a one-run nobody who wouldn't be allowed inside the shelter anyway, and was only trying to drag everyone else down with him. The crowd began whispering, pointing at Xiao Qi, creating a large commotion against him, even though he was only trying to help. Filled with anger, Xiao Qi accepted the task of drawing the monster away, while the man led the others into the shelter. Xiao Qi turned to Aunt Zhang and said that she had always looked after him and his sister. That's why she was the only person he trusted. He asked her to take care of Linlin. The girl tried to say something to stop him, but Xiao Qi had made up his mind and promised he would come back after leading the monster away. Then, Xiao Qi turned to the man and asked if now everyone would be allowed into the shelter. The man was speechless for a moment. Xiao Qi asked him if he regretted what he had said, or if he preferred to watch everyone be wiped out. The people around started pressuring the man, who finally gave in and ordered the shelter gate to be opened, telling everyone to go in immediately. So the people entered the shelter, while the protagonist headed in the opposite direction. And finally the door closed, saving them all. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, the monster was wreaking havoc. Xiao Qi arrived shouting, drawing the creature's attention. The monster quickly turned toward him and began to chase. At that moment, Xiao Qi thought the monster's appearance looked strange, and that maybe the shelter wasn't safe after all. Then he had a flashback to the past, when a man had expelled them, saying that being a 1 rune and a 0 rune made them worthless. Xiao Qi wondered if runes had any real value now, in a situation like that. His top priority was to save his little sister, Linlin, and lure the monster far away. So, he ran and hid behind a wall, but noticed that 2 people were trying to take cover in the same alley he had entered. Without hesitation, he ran to the other side, drawing the monster away with him. Once again, he tried to hide around a corner, wondering why the Zhang family still hadn't arrived. The monster appeared above the alley where Xiao Qi was hiding, though he didn't notice. At that moment, he thought the creature resembled a wolf spider, a predator that hunted using vision and vibrations. Just then, the monster prepared to launch a surprise attack. However, a massive explosion of lightning lit up the entire area. Someone had arrived and protected Xiao Qi from the spider's ambush. It was a girl wielding a powerful weapon. With a single move, she delivered a slicing attack to the massive beast. Her weapon formed the shape of a lightning dragon, and the full form of the dragon appeared behind the mysterious girl. Raising her spear, she commanded the dragon to charge. The dragon struck and pierced the spider monster, defeating it in a single blow. Xiao Qi was frozen in place by the sight until the girl approached and greeted him casually, as if nothing had happened. She asked if he was okay. Seeing her up close, he realized she had 6 runes, and guessed she must be part of the Zhang family elite. He replied that he was fine, but just then a shrill sound echoed once more, and Xiao Qi began to feel something strange in his head. The monster hadn't been completely destroyed. The girl quickly stepped in front of Xiao Qi and declared she would finish it off. Xiao Qi, paralyzed, was feeling worse and worse. A mist began forming around where the monster had been, disorienting the girl. Suddenly, she was struck and thrown hard against the wall on the other side of the alley. Xiao Qi ran to her and asked if she was all right. They both turned and realized the monster was already very close. The girl said the monster had resurrected and was even stronger now. This needed to be reported. However, if she ran, the monster would quickly catch her and eliminate Xiao Qi. If she stayed and fought, Xiao Qi could escape and warn the others about what was happening. She turned to him and told him to run immediately and report to the commander that the day-level monster had resurrected and evolved into rank C. She finished by saying she would cover his retreat. Xiao Qi asked what would happen to her, but the girl insisted that he had to go. After all, she was a 6 rune, and he needed to deliver that message. The monster grew even more furious in front of them. That's when a dark mark appeared on Xiao Qi's forehead, and he felt a sharp pain in his head. The girl turned to him, asking what was going on. The monster began emanating its mana once again. The girl tried to push Xiao Qi away, but he held her arm. She quickly turned to see why. At that moment, Xiao Qi seemed to be absorbing a massive amount of energy from the surroundings, all of it flowing toward the mark on his forehead. A burst of light exploded, and he began floating in the sky, illuminating everything around him. Xiao Qi was transforming. He emerged with a new appearance, confused by what had just happened. The monster wasted no time and lunged at him, but Xiao Qi was ready. He faced the danger head-on and quickly took the form of a golden dragon, dodging the giant spider. He tried to understand what had just occurred. He wondered if that was the same blue dragon the girl had used, and now he was using her ability. The girl confirmed it, although she admitted she didn't know why they had merged. Surprisingly, Xiao Qi was wielding her powers better than she could. He replied that he didn't know what was happening either, but first, he needed to take down the monster. They could talk later. The girl quickly agreed. And so, Xiao Qi resumed the battle and summoned the golden dragon once more. This time, thousands of radiant swords appeared in the sky above the spider monster. With a single gesture, Xiao Qi launched them, and a bladed rain fell upon the creature, which had no chance to defend itself. The girl, excited, says that they won. The monster was covered in swords. Xiao Qi raised his hand and then closed it, causing all the swords to explode at once, finally eliminating the monster, which this time was left in pieces. Xiao Qi asks if the spider is really finished this time. The girl asks him to take a look, but warns him to be cautious. Xiao Qi begins to approach the monster's carcass, but at that moment, something strange happens to him. He and the girl separate again, breaking the fusion. As a result, the boy starts plummeting from the sky, falling at high speed toward the ground. However, the girl gently catches him in her arms, protecting him from a tragic end. Thus, the two land safely on the ground, leaving an awkward silence between them. Xiao Qi quickly jumps off the girl's lap and thanks her for saving him, but the girl says that, in fact, she should be the one thanking him. Suddenly, a few people appear, calling for the girl. Quickly she assures them that she is fine and that she followed the protocol as always. However, she grabs Xiao Qi's arm. The boy tries to say that his little sister is in the shelter at that moment. The mysterious girl says that his sister is probably safe there and that, for now, she wants to ask him some questions. She asks if Xiao Qi knows why they are able to fuse and why he can use her powers. Xiao Qi replies that he doesn't know anything since this was the first time it happened. He starts laughing nervously while the girl watches him closely. The girl hands a business card to Xiao Qi and says that if he needs anything in the future, he can contact her. Xiao Qi asks if he will be taken to the Institute for dissection. The girl laughs and tells him not to worry because he is far too valuable for that. Xiao Qi asks her not to talk about him as if he were an extinct animal. The girl then assures him that she will definitely protect him. Another assistant arrives and informs her that the master is looking for her. The girl answers the phone while leaving Xiao Qi and the assistant behind. The assistant, annoyed, calls the boy a lesser rune loser. And soon after, the girl hands the phone to the boy, who asks what the next orders are. The girl firmly says that the assistant is fired, leaving the boy completely shocked. Xiao Qi tries to ease the situation, saying that he is already used to these kinds of things. The girl hands another card to Xiao Qi and thanks him for his help today, saying that it's a token of appreciation. She smiles and insists that Xiao Qi accept it, reminding him that besides saving her, he saved everyone there. Thus, Xiao Qi accepts the card and puts it in his pocket. On the card was written the name Zhong Yuyan. Finally, Xiao Qi says goodbye to the girl and thanks her for everything. Yuyan, watching him from afar, believes that Xiao Qi is the key to changing things. Sometime later, Xiao Qi was already at home taking care of his sister, who was sick. Even though she was coughing a lot, Linlin kept telling Xiao Qi that she was fine. However, Xiao Qi pointed out that she had a fever and then asked if she had been scared yesterday, recalling the moment from the previous night when they had met again. Linlin had run to hug him, while the people around praised the protagonist in every possible way, even calling him a hero. The arrogant man had even knelt before Xiao Qi, apologizing for what he had done and admitting that he was wrong. Then, someone had forcibly dragged the man out of the place, throwing him out of the shelter. Back to the present moment, Linlin said she had always been a burden to Xiao Qi, at all times, including now. But the protagonist denied that. Holding Linlin's hand, he told her that they were family, not strangers. However, if she still felt guilty, then when she got better, Xiao Qi asked her to make the supreme pork rib and radish soup that only Linlin knew how to make. Excited, the girl replied that she would do it. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. Xiao Qi said he would check who it was and asked Linlin to take her medicine and get some sleep. Then, Xiao Qi opened the door to see who was there and noticed a crowd of people standing in front of his door. Xiao Qi asked if they were there because of the fusion with Miss Zhong. The man in red replied that yes, they were, and that he had come under the lady's orders. Suddenly, a man in a lab coat appeared, grabbed Xiao Qi and examined him, confirming that he was just a rune. But how could he use the power of people much stronger than him? Could this be a new mutation worth researching? Xiao Qi quickly broke free from the man, and a woman who was there asked if the man intended to dissect Xiao Qi, showing off all his attributes. The woman then asked if the protagonist wouldn't prefer to join the Shen family, since it was also a noble family like the Zhong family. The people around started commenting that the protagonist was becoming the darling of two important families, and that this would be very good for him. But Xiao Qi could see that it was all just a facade, and remembered what those people really thought of him. So, Xiao Qi decided to propose a deal and test each family, one at a time. That way, he would join whichever one proved to be superior. At that moment, people finally revealed their true faces, saying that he should look at himself in the mirror first, since he was nothing but a damned rune. Xiao Qi then showed the card he had received earlier and said that they were the ones begging him to join their family. Then, Xiao Qi turned and said that, since Miss Zhong had kindly invited him, he would visit the Zhong family first. He also added that his younger sister had a fever and that, therefore, he would need to take her to the hospital first. The representative of the Zhong family said it was fine, and that he would take Xiao Qi and his sister to the private hospital affiliated with the Zhong family. But Xiao Qi slammed the door shut in front of everyone, leaving the guy talking to himself. Xiao Qi returned to the room where Linlin was. He asked her not to worry and explained that everything was fine. At that moment, a crow was watching them through the window. Night fell at the Zhong family mansion. Some people were gathered there until Xiao Qi arrived at the meeting along with the representative. The people began commenting on the protagonist's power level, but others quickly realized that he was someone personally invited by Miss Zhong. So, Xiao Qi followed the representative through the mansion hall. At that moment, a man appeared, calling for Butler Sol. He asked if Sol wasn't being rude by letting a rune enter there. Butler Sol bowed and explained to Master Kui that this was a guest of Miss Zhong, then politely asked him to clear the way. Kui looked directly at Xiao Qi and asked if garbage could really be considered a guest. The butler was about to say something more to Master Kui, but Xiao Qi interrupted, saying it was fine. Kui then poured his drink over Xiao Qi's head, and asked if he was still going to keep pretending. He also told Xiao Qi to drink some of it, saying it was a high-quality red wine, something humble people like Xiao Qi would never get to taste in their lives. Annoyed, Xiao Qi said that Kui was the one who had started all this. Kui prepared himself and said that Xiao Qi would soon be eliminated, but the protagonist struck Kui directly, leaving him in shock. Kui fell to the ground and wondered why he couldn't transform. Xiao Qi bent down, grabbed Kui by the collar, and demanded an apology. Kui refused, so Xiao Qi saw no other choice but to continue what he was doing, giving that petty guy a good lesson. After a long and intense dialogue, Kui finally started to apologize. Xiao Qi then stepped back, thinking that this guy might be superior in terms of the number of runes, but he seemed very weak, as he couldn't even transform. Kui started getting up and asked if Xiao Qi was done. At that moment, the protagonist looked back. Kui was beginning to transform, and an aura was radiating from his body. Xiao Qi realized that the red light was a sign of transformation. Driven by revenge, Kui said he would finish Xiao Qi right there. But at that very moment, a portal began to form behind Kui. A huge and ferocious monster emerged behind him and struck him directly. The people around began to run in desperation upon seeing a beast being summoned inside the Zhong family's territory. Xiao Qi stood paralyzed in front of that monster. Butler Sol grabbed Xiao Qi's arm and told him to follow quickly. Xiao asked why no one was doing anything, since everyone there had superior runes. Butler Sol replied that having a superior rune didn't mean the person had combat skills, as only after training could a superior rune grant adequate fighting ability. Thinking of his boss, Butler Sol commented that the training was hard to endure, and that the number of noble children who passed it was small. At that moment, someone was thrown at the feet of Xiao Qi and the butler. The beast was leaping toward them at that instant. Xiao Qi was startled by the fast and fierce attack, but suddenly, someone struck the beast. It was a girl who looked like a loli. She stood in front of Xiao Qi and called the beast a bad dog. The wolf monster quickly got back on its feet. The girl asked Xiao Qi to get to a safe place as fast as possible. Seeing the girl's back, Xiao Qi remembered something from his past. However, the monster was charging toward them. The girl, standing before the creature, quickly drew her magical weapon and then jumped at the monster. But the large wolf howled at that moment, stunning everyone in the hall. The girl dropped her axe and was about to fall on Xiao Qi. Then, a big collision occurred. The girl fell on top of the protagonist. Even while being squashed, Xiao Qi asked if she was okay. The two got up quickly, and yet another awkward moment happened. The wolf monster, with that powerful howl, had summoned more monsters like itself. Thus, a large pack of fierce wolves was about to attack. Several people in the hall were chased by the small, ferocious wolves. Seeing this, the girl grabbed Xiao Qi's hand and asked him to run quickly. But with the two united, the wolves were swiftly eliminated all at once. The big wolf could only see a silhouette appearing from within the smoke that filled the place. Xiao Qi had fused once again, and he wondered why he was pink this time. The girl said pink was very cute, and then told Xiao Qi to use the axe to defeat the monster. The protagonist, excited, agreed with her. Wolves that had been defeated by the protagonist began to be absorbed by the giant wolf. But soon after, other wolves started appearing again. Xiao Qi, watching everything carefully, tried to understand the enemy's tricks. Once more, the small wolves charged toward Xiao Qi, and using his axe, he began eliminating them one by one, until he thought he might not be able to finish them all, even though he had already taken down the ones around him. Then, Xiao Qi asked the girl if she got dizzy when riding those spinning teacups. The girl, not knowing what he was talking about, asked what that was, saying she had no idea, and also asked if Xiao Qi could take her there someday. The protagonist agreed, and the girl was happy. Xiao Qi promised that once they were done with that monster, he would take her and Linlin to the amusement park. With a powerful spinning motion, Xiao Qi managed to eliminate all the monsters nearby. The giant wolf, furious about that, decided to charge toward the protagonist. The monster tried to bite Xiao Qi while he was spinning, but spotting an opening to win, Xiao Qi hurled his axe with all his strength. The axe struck the ceiling of the hall, piercing through the beast and leaving a large hole in its body. Immediately after, Xiao Qi checked to see if he had truly defeated the wolf monster, and with a relieved sigh, realized that it was indeed over. Thus the girl's fusion with Xiao Qi was undone, just like the previous time. The girl jumped toward Xiao Qi, overjoyed, as they were finally going to the amusement park. At that moment, Zhong Yuyan entered the room, asking if Xiao Qi was all right, but ended up witnessing a rather questionable scene. Zhong Yuyan greeted Miss Luo, and Luo, calling Zhong Yuyan her younger sister, replied that it had been a while since they last met. Xiao Qi was surprised and asked if Zhong Yuyan was really Luo's younger sister. The young one confirmed it was true, and that Luo was actually many years older. Zhong Yuyan apologized to Xiao Qi for everything he had gone through that night. She said they should meet with her father first, and that, as they walked, they could talk about other things. Meanwhile, in a dark corner of the hall, there was a very mysterious man, quietly laughing to himself. Xiao Qi, sensing something, turned to see what it was, but when Zhong Yuyan asked what was wrong, he replied that it was nothing. Zhong Yuyan told Xiao Qi not to worry, as the Zhong family would handle it. In the hall, Butler Sol was trying to organize everything. He asked people to return to their homes and explained that there would be an escort. He also said the Zhong family would properly explain what had happened there. Before leaving the hall, Zhong Yuyan commented that the monster that appeared was of a similar level to the one that had shown up in the commercial district earlier, and that such a thing should never have happened. She went on to say that there were barriers in the district, meant to prevent exactly that kind of occurrence, unless the barriers had failed. Xiao Qi asked if he might have been the cause of the barrier's abnormality. Zhong Yuyan turned away, a bit awkwardly, and said that it was a possibility. Luo reassured Xiao Qi, telling him not to be afraid, as they were there to protect him. Thus, the three of them arrived at the door to Zhong Yuyan's father's quarters. She knocked and announced that she had brought Xiao Qi and Luo Ran. A voice from inside told them to come in. However, as they entered, a teacup came flying at high speed and hit Zhong Yuyan in the face. Luo immediately stepped in front of Zhong Yuyan with an irritated expression. an old man sitting on a throne ordered everyone to kneel. Zhang Youyan even tried to lower herself at that moment, but was stopped by Xiao Qi, who held her by the arm. In a serious tone, Xiao Qi asked for permission to speak, then questioned if that was the Master Zhang's way of showing his power to him. The old man watched them in silence for a moment, and then said that this was a matter for the Zhang family, and that an outsider could not interfere. Xiao Qi even tried to say something, but Zhang Youyan interrupted him. Even so, Xiao Qi commented that he hadn't imagined that noble families didn't know how to receive their guests. Then he turned to leave the room, but just as he set foot outside, the old man shouted, saying that the monsters were coming after him. Xiao Qi froze where he was, and a deep silence took over the room. After that, the protagonist left the room and slammed the door. Luo, who had also left the room with Xiao Qi, sighed and said that the old man was really annoying. While thinking about Zhang Youyan, Xiao Qi remarked that it seemed like Youyan didn't have a good relationship with his father. Luo explained that Youyan's mother had been pushed to her death by that old man. She also said that the number of runes a child received was a matter of chance, and that, to increase the chances of giving birth to a superior rune, some noble families chose to marry close relatives. Xiao Qi then asked what Zhang Youyan's mother had been. Luo said that Youyan's mother had been forced to marry her own cousin, and after giving birth, became mentally unstable. Xiao Qi grew a little thoughtful about that. Luo gave the protagonist a few pats on the back and said that these things weren't a secret, but she thought it would be better if Youyan personally told him some things. Suddenly, Luo asked if Xiao Qi wanted to join Group S, and said that if he wanted, he would be recruited directly by the boss. Xiao Qi thanked her for the offer but said he would need to think it over. Then, Luo asked if Xiao Qi wanted to go with her to the underground auction that night. Luo had heard there would be an ancient jade at the auction, with the effect of protecting the body and nourishing the spirit. And since Xiao Qi's little sister was sick, that item would be very useful for her. Xiao Qi agreed to go, but Luo asked if he had a suit suitable for the occasion. Xiao Qi confirmed that he did, as he had bought one when he was trying to get a job as an insurance salesman. Luo, however, said that suit wouldn't do, and that she would take him to buy a new one. A few hours later, Xiao Qi was feeling a bit embarrassed. He was trying on some suits along with Luo. The girl, excited, asked if he wanted to take the 2 sets he had tried on, but Xiao Qi declined, saying it would be a huge waste. At that moment they heard someone recognizing Chief Luo and commenting that she was out with her new boyfriend. It was a couple with a very extravagant appearance, but Luo simply ignored them and asked the store clerk to pack all the suits because she would take them. The man insisted, saying he didn't know Chief Luo liked delicate men. Even so, Luo continued to ignore him, which made him very angry. The woman accompanying the man approached him, telling him they should leave. But he pushed her hard and told her to get lost, saying she didn't have permission to speak there. The shove was so strong the young woman nearly fell backward, but someone quickly appeared and caught her before she hit the ground. It was a girl with red hair, who asked if she was okay. The shaken woman thanked her for the kindness, and the red-haired girl replied that there was no need to thank her. Then she stood up and said, "Trash will always be trash." The man, now enraged, charged at the red-haired girl, but with a single move, she ended all his chances. He fell before her, nearly vomiting from the brutal counterattack. Xiao Qi, watching it all, thought that this girl was really skilled. Suddenly, a portal began to form behind the red-haired girl. Xiao Qi was startled, realizing it was happening again. He quickly shouted, warning everyone to be careful. The girl was standing right in front of the portal, from which some strange monster limbs were emerging. She was quickly grabbed by the creature that was about to come through and dragged into the portal. At the last moment, someone grabbed her leg. This scene caught Luo's attention, who at that very moment was paying for the suits. She panicked when she saw that Xiao Qi was trying to save the girl, but was also about to be pulled into the portal. Luo tried to run to help Xiao Qi, but just as she got closer, the portal closed completely, swallowing both the red-haired girl and Xiao Qi. Luo was left speechless. Meanwhile, inside the portal, Xiao Qi was wondering where the girl who had entered with him was. The girl replied that she was right there. The protagonist, feeling relieved, turned to ask if she was okay, as he had fallen onto something very soft. However, upon looking more closely, he realized that he had fallen on top of the girl, which left him extremely embarrassed. The girl stood up furiously, calling him a dog. Xiao Qi replied that he hadn't done it on purpose and added that the place was very dangerous. But the girl began to shine like a blazing flame, saying that the whole situation was extremely irritating. The light emanating from her hair illuminated everything around them. Then she shouted that if the monster didn't appear soon, she would burn everything nearby. At that moment, Xiao Qi thought that the monster had taken them into a dimensional space, but he wondered why it would do that. Suddenly, something started to emerge at the girl's feet. The protagonist sensed the danger and quickly pushed her out of the way. She fell to the ground, not understanding what had just happened, and when she was about to ask why Xiao Qi had done that, she found him completely injured. The girl looked at the protagonist in disbelief, unable to accept that he had saved her. Then, she extended her hand and began to emit a healing fire, covering Xiao Qi's body. A few minutes later, after she had completely healed the protagonist, the monster's claws emerged and lunged toward them. But once again, using her power, the girl quickly created a shield, protecting herself and the protagonist from the mysterious creature's claws. At that moment, the girl tried to wake Xiao Qi, and he finally regained consciousness. She did everything she could to keep him awake, but his eyes began to close again. Just before falling asleep, he caught one last glimpse of the girl's face. In his mind, Xiao Qi relived his childhood, when a group of boys used to bully him. After a long session of beatings, the boys turned and walked away, leaving little Xiao Qi lying on the ground in the middle of the rain. Then, a shadow appeared over him. It became clear that he had been protecting something very important. Standing before Xiao Qi was a small girl with red hair. Even though he was injured, the protagonist managed to sit up slightly and handed the cake he had been protecting to the girl, wishing her a happy birthday and calling her Xiaolin. Upon seeing this, the girl couldn't hold back and burst into tears. Xiao Qi asked her not to cry, assuring her that he was fine. Back in the present moment, Xiao Qi repeated the same phrase, saying that he was fine. The girl replied that she wasn't worried. She just didn't want him to throw his life away to save her. At that moment, the fire emanating from her grew even stronger, enveloping them both as they fused. Thus, the protagonist emerged once again, now fused, with the appearance of a blazing phoenix. The girl, Lin, asked why that was happening and why Xiao Qi was using her powers. He tried to explain that he could fuse with someone who possessed a superior rune and thereby use their power. Lin then told him to ask her first before doing something like that. Xiao Qi replied that he still didn't fully understand how it worked, and that she was the third person he had fused with. The girl was outraged upon hearing she was the third, and said she didn't want to fuse with Xiao Qi anymore. But at that moment, the monster began to break through the shield Lin had formed. Xiao Qi simply said they could talk about it after they got out of there. The monster's claws broke through the shield, but the protagonist managed to dodge the attack and continued evading every blow one after another. Looking around, Xiao Qi remarked that there were still many unanswered questions in that place. While dodging the attacks, he asked why Lin had been chosen this time and why they had been brought there instead of being eliminated right away. Then, he ignited a flame in his hand and threw it toward the back of the cave. Instantly, the monster's claws stopped attacking and rushed toward the fire at full speed. Lin asked what was going on, and Xiao Qi explained that he had figured it all out. The monster was attracted to fire, which was why it had captured Lin. The creature's claws seemed mesmerized by the flame, and Xiao Qi believed the monster wanted to claim the fire for itself. Then he looked up and noticed a kind of cocoon from which the monster's claws extended. Suddenly, the strange cocoon began to move. Xiao Qi grabbed a dagger and, without hesitation, charged toward the cocoon. But just as he was about to strike the creature, a massive explosion occurred, throwing him back for a moment. Trying to see what had happened, Xiao Qi muttered, "That was close." A silhouette emerged from the smoke. A moth-like monster declared that they had finally met again. Xiao Qi and Lin wondered if they knew that creature, and with a haunting gaze, the moth pleaded for them to never leave her again. With a leap into the air, the moth launched her claws toward the protagonist. Xiao Qi dodged quickly, leaving the moth confused. He took the opportunity to ask if Lin had any thoughts about the situation. The moth, even more euphoric, asked why he was going to her. Lin replied that she simply thought Xiao Qi might have had a private moment with that monster earlier. Xiao Qi lowered his head, embarrassed, and said nothing about it. He took the chance to distance himself a bit more. The moth asked if something was wrong, and, taking on a different posture, stated that she would have to find another way to bring him to her. With a supersonic scream, she called out, "Monarch," and activated her ability. A huge web of silk shot toward Xiao Qi, but using a conjuration, he set the silk on fire, completely destroying the moth's special ability. Lin was impressed by the strength with which Xiao Qi used his abilities, but she had no idea he was about to go even further. Activating a radiant phoenix above him, he raised one of his hands and launched it forward. Meanwhile, the moth, with a frightening smile, said the monarch's attack was useless. She prepared for a counterattack, and once again, the same attack from the cave floor began to form, aiming directly at the phoenix and preventing it from getting close to the moth. Seeing that his attack had been in vain, Xiao Qi remarked that it seemed the flames couldn't harm the moth. Lin asked what they were going to do now. Xiao Qi replied that this was the moth's territory, and that the longer they stayed there, the more disadvantaged they would be. And since she was trying to capture them, he wondered if there might be a way to use that to their advantage. Lin asked what Xiao Qi was planning. He answered that the plan was quite simple, but risky. He would start by pretending to be weak, and when captured and taken to the moth, he would break free and take her down while she was distracted. That way, they could successfully defeat the monster. Lin asked if that plan wasn't too simple, since Xiao Qi wasn't accounting for how dangerous it was. He smiled and said he had already warned her it was a gamble. At that moment, Lin apologized, saying it was all her fault, but Xiao Qi replied that, in truth, the reason could also be him. In any case, he said they both needed to get out of there first. So Xiao Qi stood still as the moth's claws quietly approached him. And then he was caught by them. The moth was overjoyed to have captured the monarch. She asked him to come to her obediently. As Xiao Qi got closer, the moth said she had been looking for him for a very long time. But at that moment, Xiao Qi already had his dagger in hand, and suddenly, with a fierce strike, he broke free from the monster's grasp and dashed forward at high speed, hitting the moth squarely. Reeling from the blow, the moth could only call out for the monarch. In that moment, the protagonist was hit with a vision of the moth's memories. She had once been a beautiful creature serving tea to her master. Xiao Qi was the man she called monarch. But something had gone wrong, and in desperation, the little moth had asked the monarch what was happening. Suddenly, another man appeared, kicking the moth and saying that the puppet had truly fallen in love, and that if it hadn't been for so-and-so, he would have destroyed her. Back in the present, Xiao Qi asked what kind of image that was, and, shocked, also asked if the moth really knew him. With a calm aura, the moth simply said that she had overstepped her bounds and then wished for the flames to burn away her sins. The cave where the moth had lived began to collapse. Suddenly, Xiao Qi and Lin were back in the clothing store. Lin hugged Xiao Qi and told him he was a really nice guy. In Xiao Qi's hand was a totem of the moth in her most human form. Upon seeing it, Luo wondered if it was a rune totem. Xiao Qi, upon seeing the small wooden doll glowing, asked if Luo was referring to the pattern on the wooden figure. Suddenly, the little doll came to life. Xiao Qi was amazed. The moth had truly survived. Luo then corrected the protagonist, saying she was talking about a totem. She explained that a rune totem refers to a puppet that serves a high-level rune specialist, and is generally divided into two types: service and guardian. Xiao Qi held the small moth in his hand, and asked if Luo believed it could be something like that. Lin, seeing the tiny creature in Xiao Qi's hand, said it was really cool because she was amazing. Luo, inspecting it more closely, asked where that rune totem had come from. Xiao Qi tried to explain that the monster was gone, and only this remained, and that he had brought it back unconsciously. Luo said that the rune totem had signed a contract and would now obey him. But then she asked, what if the totem was dangerous? Lin crouched down, apologizing, and said she hadn't managed to warn Xiao Qi in time. Xiao Qi replied that from now on, he would be more careful. Luo sighed and said she was worried about him. Xiao Qi thanked her for the concern and said he still had a lot to learn. Luo lowered her head, agreeing with the protagonist, and then cheerfully invited him to join her group. Xiao Qi quickly changed the subject, asking if they were going to the auction that evening. He then started leading Luo out of the store, urging her to hurry. At that moment, Luo said she had already informed Zhong Yuyan about what happened there, and had also told her that Xiao Qi was safe. She then told Xiao Qi to go and change clothes. Nervously, he asked if everything was all right with the Zhong family. Luo confirmed that she had called and asked, and Yuyan had replied that she was fine. Suddenly, Lin burst out laughing in the middle of the room and asked why Xiao Qi was so worried about other people. She said that since he had been encountering so many monsters lately, he might just find one at the auction too. Xiao Qi refused to think like that, saying he'd have to be really unlucky for that to happen. A few hours later, a huge explosion rocked the auction. Xiao Qi was running with a mermaid girl in his arms, fleeing from a massive monster, shouting that Qing Qi had cursed him. The mermaid girl asked who that was. Xiao Qi replied that it wasn't the time to worry about that, and kept running as the monster closed in on them. A few hours before the chaos, the auction was just about to begin, and the host was welcoming the attendees. Meanwhile, in a private VIP room, Xiao Qi, Luo, and Lin were seated, watching the auction. Xiao Qi asked why everyone was dressed so formally. Lin, who was also uncomfortable, commented that there were a lot of problems with the auction's organization. Luo, calmly sipping her tea, said they could take pictures of anything they wanted, since little sister Yuyan had already catalogued everything from there. Xiao Qi was surprised by that, while Lin got extremely excited by the idea. But Luo turned to Lin and said it didn't apply to her. Xiao Qi commented that he was a little embarrassed. Luo replied there was no need. After all, Yuyan was trying to recruit him. Luo continued, saying that Yuyan was the most powerful businesswoman she had ever seen, and was willing to pay a lot for Xiao Qi. Then she looked directly at the protagonist and said it showed he was worth it. Returning to her tea, Luo added that she was very envious and wished she had that kind of money. Lin shouted that she wished the same. She began to cry and said she had heard that some ancient weapons would be sold at the auction, but she wouldn't have the money to buy them. In a desperate move, Lin clung to Xiao Qi's legs and begged him to buy something for her too. But the protagonist simply replied that he didn't have the money for it. Lin insisted, saying Zhong Yuyan was giving him money. Xiao Qi replied bluntly that it was only for him. Suddenly, Luo stood up, interested in an item from the auction. Xiao Qi, curious, also got up to see. The announcer asked everyone to pay attention, as this was the evening's surprise. An assistant began pulling the cloth off a large water tank, revealing a beautiful mermaid inside. The announcer said that although many rare items had been found across the world, the first mermaid had only been discovered 30 years ago, and now they had found a second. That scene left the protagonist in shock. The little mermaid looked very sad, until she looked directly at Xiao Qi, and the connection between them happened instantly, leaving the protagonist completely captivated. Luo also seemed saddened by the situation, saying that sometimes items like that appear. Lin commented that it was disgusting, while Luo seemed fascinated. After all, that girl was a mermaid. The protagonist asked what a mermaid was, and Luo explained that the phenomenon of taking on non-human traits is called activism. As everyone had seen before, this also occurs with some high-level rune users who display animal traits during battle. These animal features function like runes, and are seen as part of King Yu's power. Some believe that the secret behind King Yu's power can be found in those who have returned to their ancestral roots, like that mermaid. Lin remarked that this was probably just an excuse, and that people were only after her beauty. The mermaid kept staring through the glass toward the protagonist, and the two seemed to exchange an intense gaze. Xiao Qi then turned to Luo and asked whether Yuyan had set any limits on what he could buy. Luo confirmed that she had not placed any restrictions. Lin, in disbelief, asked if Xiao Qi was really going to do it. Use a woman's money to buy another. Xiao Qi replied that he simply wanted to save her. Lin accepted that, and said that in any case, if Zhong Yuyan were there, she would probably do the same. Thus, the mermaid's auction began, with an initial bid of 100 million. People started bidding frantically. The representative of the Qi family was fiercely competing, while Luo and Xiao Qi's representative was also raising the bids relentlessly. Lin looked to the side and asked if that was the Qi family's booth, calling them a bunch of lunatics. Xiao Qi, who was placing the bids himself, continued pressing the button and increasing the amount. He stood up and said that after spending so much, he was worried that Zhong Yuyan would scold him. Lin commented that the mermaid would be doomed to a life of suffering in the hands of the Qi family if they didn't save her. So Xiao Qi placed the maximum allowed bid. The auctioneer began the final countdown. The Qi family's man watched furiously. Xiao Qi and Luo were tense, while the mermaid still wore a sad expression as the countdown ended, until the gavel came down and the mermaid was finally sold. Xiao Qi collapsed onto the couch, relieved. Lin smiled and said they could finally say the mermaid was saved. But suddenly, a massive explosion occurred. The three of them quickly turned to see what had happened. The auction hall was completely destroyed, and cries for help could be heard in the distance. Then, an enormous sea creature appeared in the auditorium, holding the auctioneer in one of its limbs. The monster resembled a giant kraken. It turned to the others who were still trying to flee. The small mermaid's tank had been knocked over, but she couldn't do anything, still trapped inside. Xiao Qi told Luo to save the people first. Luo and Lin jumped through the glass, weapons already in hand. Lin was pulling Xiao Qi by the arm and asked him if he was afraid of heights. The three of them soon stood before the massive sea monster. Luo said she would hold the creature off first, then turned and told Xiao Qi to rescue the mermaid. Xiao Qi agreed and told her to be careful. With that, Luo charged at the monster, wielding her enormous axe. The protagonist called for Lin to come with him quickly. Moments later, Xiao Qi reached the tank where the mermaid was being held. He told her not to worry. Lin asked Xiao Qi to stand back, as she was about to break open the tank. With a strike to the top of the glass, Lin freed the mermaid. The protagonist quickly caught her in his arms. Lin told Xiao Qi to run ahead and said she would stay behind to support Luo Ran. At that moment, several tentacles from the monster came toward them, but Lin quickly used her sword to block the attack. She turned and shouted for Xiao Qi to go quickly. Meanwhile, Luo and Lin were battling the ferocious beast. The two of them continued slicing through as many tentacles as they could, which only enraged the monster further. With a powerful blow, the creature managed to strike them both at once and smash through one of the auction building's walls, heading after Xiao Qi, who shouted in desperation that Qing Qi and Lin had cursed him. The monster was getting closer and closer to Xiao Qi. At that moment, the beast attacked with one of its tentacles, and Xiao Qi, holding the mermaid in his arms, realized there was no way to escape. He wondered if the mermaid had fainted. Looking at the girl, he tried to wake her until she suddenly opened her eyes in fright and screamed. Surprised, Xiao Qi didn't understand why she reacted that way. But then the mermaid looked at him and began crying uncontrollably. Desperate, the protagonist begged her not to cry. Once again he picked her up, but the mermaid cried even more, this time with even greater intensity. At that moment, a bright light fell upon Xiao Qi and the mermaid, and the two fused together, forming a new appearance for our protagonist. That transformation caught the attention of the sea monster. Meanwhile, Xiao Qi appeared before the mermaid in a place that looked like an ocean. He asked if that was the world inside her mind, and if it was some kind of ability of hers. The mermaid, still a bit emotional, looked around. Xiao Qi approached her and wiped the tears from her face. He explained that they had fused, and while they were holding hands, a glowing aura enveloped them. But Xiao Qi warned her that they needed to defeat the monster first. The mermaid gathered a bit of courage and said she would try. The two returned to the real world, and the girl confirmed that yes, it was indeed her ability. Xiao Qi explained that they were now fused and could only separate after defeating the monster. As he prepared to attack, he told the mermaid never to cry again in the middle of a battle. Then, Xiao Qi charged at the monster. He managed to land a direct hit, but realized something was wrong. He tried to strike the monster with the tip of his trident, but once again, the attack had no effect. Xiao Qi finally understood that he wouldn't be able to pierce the monster's skin. The mermaid, desperate, asked if they were going to have a baby now that they had fused. The protagonist, confused, replied that it had nothing to do with that, and it wasn't what she was thinking. In that moment of distraction, the monster managed to land a hit on Xiao Qi. The mermaid, calling him husband, asked if he was okay. Xiao Qi, slightly injured and struggling to stand, began to be enveloped by an aura. Using one of the mermaid's abilities, he started to regenerate. Meanwhile, he returned to speak with the mermaid, who was still worried about her so-called husband. The protagonist asked her to just call him Xiao Qi. The mermaid apologized, then began to panic, saying that everything was her fault. She remembered a moment from her childhood when she was judged by the people around her and ultimately abandoned, as they believed she had caused the death of her parents. At that time, the little mermaid could only cry and say it was all her fault. She felt very alone and blamed herself for everything that happened around her. In the present, once again, Xiao Qi approached and wiped her tears. He asked why she was crying again and explained that it wasn't her fault, that she was the true victim in all of this. He assured her that everything would be fine and asked that they return quickly, because he believed the two of them could defeat the monster easily. Back in the real world, Xiao Qi asked the girl to just watch. Then, he leapt forward at high speed, charging toward the sea monster with his weapon in hand. This time, the monster tried to attack him with its tentacles, but the protagonist dodged them all and kept moving. Xiao Qi began pushing aside the tentacles blocking his path, and then, without hesitation, entered the monster's mouth. The mermaid, witnessing the scene, panicked, believing that Xiao Qi had just been swallowed by the creature. Meanwhile, inside the monster, Xiao Qi was still moving toward his goal. However, as he passed through the creature's stomach, several monstrous worms appeared around him. Finally, Xiao Qi noticed their presence and wondered if there were really monsters inside that monster. One of the worms turned toward him and tried to attack, hitting the shield that surrounded him. Xiao Qi questioned what he should do, then attacked all the monsters, cutting down everyone he saw around him. But the protagonist realized there were too many of them. The mermaid started crying again, saying she was very scared. Xiao Qi attacked once more and turning around commented that the mermaid cried too much. Once again, she began to apologize and said everything was her fault. Xiao Qi replied that it wasn't true and asked why she kept apologizing and crying all the time. At that moment, memories from the mermaid's childhood returned to her mind. A woman held her by the arm, saying she was causing too many problems. The mermaid tried to break free, apologizing and saying she wouldn't do anything wrong again. But the woman locked her in an isolated place, saying that to stop causing trouble, she would stay there to be punished. The little mermaid began to cry, and one of her tears turned into a pearl. The woman took the pearl and locked the mermaid in a secluded room. Back to the present, the mermaid wanted to reach the protagonist, but her mind was so full of bad thoughts that she couldn't approach him. Xiao Qi's image disappeared from her sight, and, frightened, she apologized once more. Suddenly, someone appeared before her with a glowing pearl. The pearl shone so brightly that the mermaid turned to see who was carrying it. It was Xiao Qi, who said he had found the luminous pearl and asked the mermaid to take it. She felt very happy and thanked the protagonist for the kind gesture. Back in the real world, the protagonist welcomed the mermaid again and said he had finally found what he was looking for. Looking at a spot inside the monster, he said he had discovered its weakness. The mermaid then said she understood now. The protagonist's plan was to destroy the monster from the inside, since the creature's skin was impenetrable. The protagonist smiled confidently and confirmed that was exactly it. He also remarked that the mermaid looked very pretty when she smiled. Then, he positioned himself to launch another attack, this time a direct one. Forming a huge water spiral, Xiao Qi charged forward with his trident toward the monster's weak spot, striking with all his strength and finally managing to pierce the skin of that sea beast. Meanwhile, on the outside, the monster began to sense something was wrong. Luo and Lin were already standing before the creature, which suddenly started to scream and thrash in front of the girls. In that moment, the protagonist managed to break out from inside the monster, appearing right in front of Lin and Luo, and casually saying hi as if nothing had happened. The girls were surprised by the sudden appearance, but as they approached, they asked what kind of fusion style that was. Startled, the protagonist asked the mermaid why they were still fused. The mermaid replied that she didn't know either. Luo asked how the fusion had been undone in the past. The protagonist answered that it had been quite simple. The fusion was reversed once the monster died. Then, Xiao Qi turned and asked if maybe the monster was still alive, but the creature was already beginning to fade away at that moment, making the situation even more confusing. Xiao Qi panicked, asking why they couldn't undo the fusion. The mermaid responded that her husband needed to find a solution quickly. At that moment, Luo, Lin, and Yuyan questioned why the mermaid had called him husband. Sometime later, Xiao Qi was being examined to determine why he was still in that condition. The girls were watching everything from outside the room. Yuyan asked Lin if it wasn't a bit strange, then turned to the protagonist's sister, who was on a video call via the tablet Lin was holding, and said that Xiao Qi wasn't in danger, so they didn't need to worry. In fact, they should get some rest. Luo smiled and agreed, telling Linlin that good children need proper rest. Lin felt very embarrassed seeing that at the time, and Yuyan explained that Luo was like that when she liked someone, so she asked Lin to get used to it quickly. Linlin said goodbye and said she would go ahead, until suddenly she shouted Xiao Qi's name. At that moment, our protagonist was lying on the examination bed crying. Yuyan rushed to the intercom and asked what was going on. Finally, the doctor allowed her to enter the room. The doctor explained to Yuyan that after several tests, they had reached a conclusion. He ended by saying that Mr. Qi was just an ordinary man, and that nothing could be detected about the mermaid he had fused with. Yuyan said she understood, and asked the doctor to leave. She approached Xiao Qi, and asked if he was crying because of the mermaid. Xiao Qi answered that he didn't know why, but ever since the mermaid started crying, he started too. Back in the world where the mermaid was, Xiao Qi asked what was happening, and explained that he had been talking with the others. The mermaid apologized, and said that while she was in that space, she couldn't stop thinking about the past. Xiao Qi told her not to worry, that he would find a way to reverse the fusion, and asked her to leave that place for now. Xiao Qi came back to himself, and told Yuyan that ever since fusing with the mermaid, sometimes she would pull him into that mysterious space. There, Xiao Qi could see and touch the mermaid. Also, time stood still in that space, but he couldn't stay there for too long. Yuyan asked if that was one of the mermaid's abilities, and the protagonist replied that it probably was. Lin commented that mermaids had strange abilities, which was to be expected, but upon seeing the protagonist lying on the bed, Lin wondered if it was because the fusion had gone even deeper. Yuyan replied that it was possible, as up until now, scientists believed mermaids were a kind of activism, and it wouldn't be surprising if they had special abilities. Moreover, higher runes showed animal-like traits during battles, and with Xiao Qi's fusion, those traits seemed even stronger. Lin then asked if they couldn't undo the fusion because of the mermaid's activism. Yuyan said that was highly possible. Lin then said that, in other words, if they helped Lan Yuan return home, the fusion might be undone. Luo showed Linlin that her brother was doing fine, and that she could rest now. Linlin told Xiao Qi not to forget to eat, then said goodbye and that she would see him later. But after ending the call, Linlin didn't seem happy. In fact, she thought she couldn't help Xiao Qi at all and was only dragging him down. At that moment, the moth appeared near Linlin. Crying, Linlin said that her older brother would be happier without her. The next day, in the middle of the city, Lin and Xiao Qi were walking around. The people who saw our protagonist crying thought Lin was the one responsible. Lin was already finding it funny, as people were saying she had made Xiao Qi cry. The protagonist commented that, in a way, it was a little true. Lin got embarrassed and said that Yuyan and Luo were being very unfair, as they had sent only the two of them to take Lan Yuan home. The two girls said their families were dealing with some problems and asked Xiao Qi and Lin to go ahead and handle things. Xiao Qi said that when Lin talked like that, it really did sound a little suspicious. Lin agreed, and Xiao Qi thought they seemed to be avoiding something. At that moment, a car pulled up nearby, and a red carpet was rolled out toward the protagonist. A chauffeur stepped out to open the door, and then a man who looked much older got out of the car and walked toward Xiao Qi and Lin. The man approached Xiao Qi and seemed like he wanted to kiss him. Xiao Qi was very irritated by the situation, so he tried to strike the man and shouted for him to get away. As he was about to deliver another blow, he suddenly shouted, calling the man father. At that moment, Xiao Qi was confused by what had just happened. The man in front of him had tears in his eyes, and so did Xiao Qi. The man finally recognized his beloved daughter. Xiao Qi asked if he was really Lan Yuan's father, and the man promptly replied yes. Then, he tried to hug Xiao Qi and said he could now call him uncle. The protagonist dodged and said they should resolve the situation with Lan Yuan first. The man said that Miss Zhang had already explained everything to him, and then invited the protagonist to his home. Some time passed, and they arrived at the man's house. The protagonist, startled, asked if Lan Yuan had really been kidnapped. Lan Yuan explained that she had left home without telling her father, and ended up drinking a bit too much. Indignant, the protagonist fell silent for a moment. A few minutes later, they were already inside the mansion. The man said they first needed to reverse the fusion, and Xiao Qi agreed. They stood before a portal, and the man explained that Xiao Qi would need to pass a test beyond that portal. Xiao Qi asked how that was connected to the fusion, and the man said that Lan Yuan would learn to control her abilities by completing the test, and thus, the fusion would be undone. Xiao Qi commented that it seemed a little unfair, but he had no other choice. The man said it was up to the protagonist to decide. Xiao Qi approached the portal and asked how to enter it. The man explained that it was a trial left by the king for the mermaids, and all he had to do was touch the portal. He also added that Xiao Qi could take some time to prepare, but the protagonist declined and asked them to wait for him there. Then he placed his hand on the portal. Xiao Qi was pulled into the trial. Seeing the man cry, Lin said he truly deserved to be called Lan Yuan's father. Meanwhile, inside the trial, Xiao Qi asked Lan Yuan if the test was difficult, but she replied that she didn't know because she had never tried it before. Then Xiao Qi asked if she knew anything about it. Lan Yuan said she had heard that there were 3 trials in the judgment. Suddenly, a burst of fire came toward the protagonist, who panicked and started running in fear. He asked if the first trial was a physical one. Right in front of him, a massive axe appeared, confirming that it was indeed a physical test. Without hesitation, Xiao Qi managed to pass through the axe with ease. Further ahead, he crossed a thorn-covered path, endured more explosions and burning flames. The test seemed endless. Xiao Qi leapt over fire again and again until he finally reached the end. Confident, he confirmed that it was merely a physical test. However, he now felt extremely exhausted. Suddenly the mermaid appeared beside him, saying that her husband was truly amazing. She hugged him and said that if it had been her, she would have failed long ago. At that moment, a whirlpool began to form where Xiao Qi stood, until something began to rise from the water. Staying alert, Xiao Qi guessed that the next trial had begun, and that it was likely one of self-defense. The water took the form of Xiao Qi and attacked him using water whips. Watching this, Xiao Qi thought it was fascinating, but the clone didn't waste time and lunged at him, launching a water tentacle. Xiao Qi grabbed the whip firmly and asked what would happen next. The clone let go of the whip and smiled at the protagonist. The whip Xiao Qi was holding began to melt, and the water formed a massive whirlpool. It was so big that it completely engulfed the protagonist, while the clone stood on the outside, ready to strike. However, Xiao Qi emerged from the whirlpool at that moment and walked toward the clone as if nothing had happened. The water clone was completely startled by the surprise attack. Xiao Qi struck it directly and dragged it to the bottom of the ocean. Then, he delivered a powerful kick, launching the clone even farther until it crashed into a nearby rock, finally disappearing. At that moment, a light began to shine from Xiao Qi's body. It was Lan Yuan, who had taken physical form again. She was happy because, even though they hadn't undone the fusion, she was now able to touch him. Suddenly, the two were teleported to another part of the map. Lan Yuan became very frightened. Seeing her reaction, the protagonist asked what was wrong. Lan Yuan ran to Xiao Qi and hugged him in fear, saying that these were her memories, and that this was the illusion trial. Xiao Qi told her not to be afraid, and asked if they were there because of that. Looking around, he commented that there didn't seem to be any danger, but Lan Yuan was crying at that moment. The protagonist realized that this must be the 3rd trial. A few minutes passed, and the trial began. Lan Yuan was reliving her painful memories. She was sitting on a bed, telling Aunt Zhang that she had been wrong. The aunt replied that Lan Yuan knew what would happen. With a dark expression, Aunt Zhang asked what Lan Yuan was going to do. Faced with this, Lan Yuan began to deny it, but she was terrified. The woman suddenly changed her expression and approached Lan Yuan, saying the girl had no one else and asking if it wasn't enough to have her by her side. Still with a grim look, the old woman claimed that she was the person who loved Lan Yuan the most. Then she asked what they could have for lunch. Lan Yuan tried to say something, but the woman interrupted, saying children needed to eat more vegetables. At that moment, Xiao Qi appeared, saying that even though it was just an illusion created by the trial, it was extremely irritating. The old woman quickly turned and asked who was there. Xiao Qi looked at the woman and said that Lan Yuan hadn't even said what she wanted to eat. Suddenly, the old woman began to laugh, loudly and maniacally. Then she pointed at Lan Yuan and said the girl knew nothing. The woman then began to transform into a terrifying creature with the body of a bird and the head of a human. At that moment, the illusion dissolved, and Lan Yuan appeared behind Xiao Qi, witnessing the horrifying creature. The bird woman launched a feather attack toward Xiao Qi, but he raised one of his hands and quickly formed a shield, preventing the feathers from reaching him. Once again, the old woman asked why Lan Yuan was rejecting her, claiming she was the only person in the entire world who loved her. In that moment, filled with courage, Lan Yuan responded that it wasn't true, that what the woman called love wasn't love at all. Instead, it was control, imprisonment, and manipulation, and those things were not love. Lan Yuan then declared that now she knew what real love was. Xiao Qi, watching Lan Yuan, began to suspect something was odd about her story. Then Lan Yuan pointed at Xiao Qi and declared that he was her husband. At that moment, the monster turned on Xiao Qi, even more furious, and said she would eliminate him right away. The creature slashed her claws at the spot where Xiao Qi stood, causing a massive explosion. The old woman stepped back, thinking she had destroyed him. But once again, the protagonist had protected himself with a shield. The creature was then surrounded by water and bound by chains. Xiao Qi asked if she knew that mermaids could control water through their emotions. The creature managed to break free. The protagonist stared at her and asked if she had ever heard of a water slash. The creature stared back and dove toward Xiao Qi at full speed, consumed by rage. Xiao Qi told Lan Yuan that she shouldn't trust people so easily, and that right now, she should be angry. Lan Yuan turned and asked if she really could get angry. Smiling confidently, the protagonist confirmed that she could. Then, Lan Yuan, who had been looking at him with a sweet expression, closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, a fish-shaped mark appeared in her eye. She raised her hand directly in front of the evil creature and, with all her anger, unleashed a powerful whirlpool attack. Not only did it push the creature far away, but it quickly destroyed it. Lan Yuan pulled the creature's body to the ground in front of her. The creature, about to disappear, still called out Lan Yuan's name while crying. The mermaid felt a little bad at that moment and ran to hug the protagonist. The creature finally vanished, and just then, a light enveloped Lan Yuan's body. Her mermaid tail turned into a pair of legs, thus undoing the fusion. Lan Yuan, excited, said she had finally passed the test. Xiao Qi asked her not to cry anymore. Lan Yuan replied that she actually wanted to cry but couldn't stop smiling when she saw Xiao Qi. At that moment, Lan Yuan's father appeared outside the portal and said it was a great job. Finally, father and daughter reunited after so many years, both deeply moved. Lan Yuan ran and hugged her father tightly. The protagonist commented that the 3 trials were difficult, especially the last one. The assistant, confused, said there were only 2 tests, one for the body and one for the mind. However, Xiao Qi insisted they had faced a 3rd trial, in which Lan Yuan had to confront her childhood fear. Moreover, it all felt very real, so he asked if it had really been an illusion. At that moment, Lan Yuan's father hugged Xiao Qi and said he approved of their marriage. The assistant remarked that it had been many years since he had seen the master so happy. Lan Yuan was both embarrassed and joyful. Her father said that she and Xiao Qi should get to know each other better. Placing his hand on Xiao Qi's shoulder, the old man said they would definitely get along. But the protagonist remained silent. He glanced sideways at Lan Yuan and, seeing the anxious expression on her face, eventually agreed. Lan Yuan was overjoyed and smiled beautifully. Xiao Qi then brought up the 3rd test again. Lan Yuan's father said his wife had told him there were only 2 trials, and she wouldn't lie about it, so it must have been only 2. The protagonist lowered his head, said he understood, and added that he needed to return home because his younger sister was waiting for him. Lan Yuan's father asked why Xiao Qi didn't bring Linlin over for dinner. Xiao Qi replied that, unfortunately, she wasn't in good health, and that the Zhang family was taking care of her treatment. So, when Lin Lin got better, he promised to bring her for a visit. The old man sighed and agreed. Then Xiao Qi said his goodbyes to both of them, who were sad to see him go. As he got into the car, Xiao Qi was deep in thought about all the remaining mysteries. He wondered whether it had truly been a coincidence that Lan Yuan was auctioned off, whether the first mermaid to be auctioned had any relation to the Lan family, why the test portal was inside the Lan family's estate, and whether that third trial had really been just an illusion. Still, at that moment, the protagonist decided to let time handle those questions. He would move forward one step at a time. The next morning, Luo was waiting for the protagonist. Xiao Qi asked why she had called him so early. Luo replied that she wanted to take him to meet Group S and hopefully recruit him. Looking around, Xiao Qi remarked that there were many people present. Luo smiled and explained that in just a few years, the group had established itself firmly among the aristocratic families due to its strength. They were also well known for their power suits and their training programs for newcomers. At that moment, a battle was taking place inside an arena. Two people wearing special suits were fighting. Luo asked Xiao Qi to watch. She explained that the place was protected by a barrier, so there was no need to worry about being harmed during the fights. Suddenly, one of the group's officers informed the two newcomers that the test had been suspended because Miss Luo was there. The two immediately stopped fighting and returned to a booth. The officer approached and greeted Luo and Xiao Qi. A bit awkwardly, the protagonist greeted her back, then was impressed when he saw the suit worn by one of the trainees. Another officer asked if Xiao Qi wanted to try the operational suit, saying it was very practical. Still a little shy, the protagonist accepted the offer. The officer told him not to be afraid, as the suit was very easy to operate. That encouraged Xiao Qi a little, and he said he would give it a try. The protagonist then positioned himself in the booth and asked what would happen next. At that moment, the suit materialized onto his body, and he flew off uncontrollably. Panicked, he tried to contact Luo. Realizing he couldn't control the suit, Xiao Qi wondered if it was taking him somewhere on its own. A few minutes passed. Xiao Qi was still flying through the sky, trying to stop the thing, but the suit simply wouldn't respond. Realizing he was approaching some mountains, he soon found himself in a place filled with buildings. He wondered if it was the experimental base. After that, the suit took him into a highly guarded room, with soldiers at their posts. Xiao Qi asked if they were enemies of Group S or traitors. Suddenly, a woman appeared, welcoming Xiao Qi. She introduced herself as Fu Shui, one of the directors of Group S. Standing next to her, Fu Shui introduced Liu Yun, the director of the research division. Xiao Qi asked why he had been brought there alone. Fu Shui replied that it was to address his problem. She said she believed the protagonist was concerned about the fusion issue, and then asked why they shouldn't solve it together. Seeing the guards behind him, the protagonist, nervous, was afraid to refuse and accepted the offer, following Fu Shui to another room. Still, Xiao Qi wondered whether Luo and the others would be able to find him in such an isolated place. Fu Shui explained that this was the secret experimental base of Group S, where they aim to enhance a person's rune power. Xiao Qi became curious, and Fu Shui continued, explaining that runes were not static. With years of training, anyone could acquire new runes, but the process was rigorous and extremely difficult to succeed in. That's why most people kept the same runes they were born with for their entire lives. Xiao Qi said that when he fused, his runes increased, and asked if Fu Shui had brought him there to study how his runes grew so quickly through fusion. Fu Shui replied that he was very smart and confirmed his suspicion. Xiao Qi paused for a moment and said that this didn't feel like a legitimate study. If it was, why had she dragged him there without informing Luo Ran? Liu Yun remained silent, simply observing the conversation. Xiao Qi went on, saying he already knew Luo was under pressure because of this, and that with him disappearing inside Fu Shui's territory, all the forces keeping an eye on him wouldn't miss the opportunity to act. Fu Shui merely replied that standing still wasn't in his best interest. At that moment, a guard appeared and told Xiao Qi to keep walking. After walking a bit further, he came across a room filled with beings trapped inside capsules. In one of them, there was a little girl with animal ears smiling and trying to get the protagonist's attention. Xiao Qi asked if he could hear what the girl had to say. Fu Shui replied yes, but said those were failed experiments, so they weren't worth his time. Even so, she handed him a tablet. Xiao Qi asked the little girl what she wanted to tell him. The girl asked if her big brother had finally come to take her home, saying the treatment had been very painful and she missed her mother. Now, with red eyes and a dark aura, the girl cried and said she wanted to go home. Fu Shui then said that experimental product 006 was overloaded and needed to be cleaned. Xiao Qi told the girl to stay calm, promising that he would definitely take her back home. The little girl smiled, hopeful to see her mother again. However, at that moment, everything changed, and her hopes were shattered. A guard then announced that the cleaning process was complete. The girl collapsed inside the capsule, lifeless and alone. Xiao Qi turned around, furious, and threw the tablet with full force toward Fu Shui. Meanwhile, the woman stated that the girl deserved to be honored, as she had dedicated herself to the advancement of humanity. Struggling to control his anger, Xiao Qi asked whether such dedication shouldn't be voluntary. Fu Shui replied that they had signed contracts and were paid. Xiao Qi then asked what would happen to him. Fu Shui approached and said he was unique, and she would not neglect him. She grabbed his arm and asked what he planned to do. The protagonist pulled out a small blade, held it to Fu Shui, and told everyone not to move. At that moment, Fu Shui began to laugh. Xiao Qi asked why she was laughing, saying that even if it was just a small laser blade, it was still enough for what he needed. Fu Shui placed her hand on Xiao Qi's face and said it was a shame he didn't want to cooperate. Then, turning with terrifying strength, she said that Xiao Qi had no idea how valuable he was, because compared to him, she was nothing. And with that, the mad woman turned around and cut herself with her own hands. Fu Shui smiled at that moment, looking at Xiao Qi until the guards grabbed him. He shouted that the woman was insane. Fu Shui replied that Xiao Qi was very kind. Xiao Qi asked if she wanted everyone to become like her, losing their humanity and harming their own kind. Fu Wei answered that everything was for the future of humanity, whether done by her or by Xiao Qi. At that moment, someone injected something into the protagonist's neck, and he quickly passed out. After that, he was taken to another part of the room. Some time passed. The soldiers continued guarding the door where Xiao Qi was being held. He lay on a stretcher, connected to various sensors. Then, the pain test began. Xiao Qi finally woke up, though still groggy, when suddenly a massive electric current was sent through his body. The scientist was recording all the test data at that moment, when outside the room, a man approached. The guards asked who he was. A few minutes later, Xiao Qi woke up again looking exhausted. The man who had been outside now appeared before him, saying that Xiao Qi was still choosing the humans. Xiao Qi looked at him, trying to understand who he was. With just a snap of his fingers, the man freed Xiao Qi from the chair. He told him he had eliminated all the scientists in the area. Finally, the face of the man who supposedly saved the protagonist was revealed. But Xiao Qi simply ignored him and began walking out of the room, saying goodbye. The man followed Xiao Qi, asking if he had nothing to say. Xiao Qi then asked who he was and why he had helped him. He also asked if the fact that he could fuse and attract monsters had anything to do with that man. The man grew uncomfortable and said he couldn't answer the first two questions, and the third one didn't make much sense. Xiao Qi thanked him for the help and turned again to leave. After the protagonist left, the man kicked the chair where Xiao Qi had been restrained, but immediately crouched down in pain, holding his foot. At that moment, another person appeared. A man with black eyes, who commented that the man in the suit had no physical aptitude and asked why he didn't find another way to deal with his frustrations. The man in the suit lowered his head and repeated that Xiao Qi was still choosing the humans. The man with black eyes said that it was because Xiao Qi had grown up as a human, but told him not to worry. Because once Xiao Qi fully understood humanity, he would definitely choose their side. Meanwhile, Xiao Qi had returned to the capsule room when an alarm sounded, announcing that the test subjects had escaped. One of the soldiers spotted Xiao Qi and alerted everyone to capture him quickly. As the soldiers surrounded Xiao Qi, the glass capsules began to break, and all the test subjects emerged from them. The soldiers opened fire on the failed experiments. One officer radioed for reinforcements while Xiao Qi stood amidst the chaos. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind, urging him to destroy everyone, claiming that those people were evil and reminding him of everything that had happened in that place. Alarmed, Xiao Qi wondered what that voice could be. The voices kept coming, and Xiao Qi questioned if they belonged to the people who had been used in the experiments. The test subjects continued charging toward the soldiers, their voices crying that they just wanted to go home, but they were easily gunned down. At that moment, Fu Shui appeared behind the soldiers. Seeing that all the subjects had fallen, Xiao Qi felt consumed by a strange energy. His eyes shone, overwhelmed by that power. Upon witnessing it, Fu Shui asked if fusion wasn't supposed to be limited to just 2 people. Xiao Qi dashed past the soldiers at supersonic speed and grabbed Fu Shui. With all the hatred those people had felt now fused into Xiao Qi. For the first time, Fu Shui felt fear, and it showed clearly on her face. We'll continue in the next episode. For more videos like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. See you next time.